Hi everyone, Father Charles here. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Absorb into the Story, Catholic Themes, and Tolkien. Today we're going to continue the theme of the unlooked-for friend. We're going to talk about a few others. I believe this series will actually be 3 installments because today we're going to talk about Strider and Galadriel, and that should be enough for one segment. We've got a few others to cover in the next episode. So if you're just tuning in, last episode we talked about Gildor and the Wood Elves, Farmer Maggot, and good old Tom Bombadil. We're talking about how, for Tolkien, the unlooked-for friend always arrives just in the nick of time at that exact right moment when the members of the Fellowship need it most to fulfill their quest. And I'm arguing that this could be based upon a deeply Catholic intuition of grace. For Catholics, grace is always a someone, not a something. Grace comes to us in an interpersonal way. And we're going to see this play out time and again in the unlooked-for friends. So more on that in the introduction of the last video. Just go to Unlooked-for Friends, Chapter 1. So let's get into Strider. You know, when I read this in 2000, it was before the movies had come out. So I didn't know that Strider was actually Aragorn. If you're one of the 5 people in the world who doesn't know that, who hasn't watched the movie, I'm assuming if you're watching this video, you've either seen the movies or you've read the book. So sorry for the spoiler alert if you're new to all of this. But yes, Strider is actually Aragorn. He's actually the king. He's descended from the race of Numenor. He's Isildur's heir. And all this is going to come to light later on in the story. All that is gold does not glitter. But when the hobbits meet him, he's just a scruffy ranger, a kind of sketchy fellow that's eyeing them warily in the Inn of the Prancing Pony at Bree. Should they trust him? Should we, the reader, trust him? Well, we shall find out. So, still fleeing eastward, the hobbits arrive at the village of Bree, located at the edge of what to their limited experience was civilization. For most of the hobbits from the Shire, going to Buckland, which was the far eastern edge of the Shire. That in itself was a stretch. Now you go another day's journey east and you come to Bree. This was for only the adventurous hobbits would travel this far east of their beloved Shire. So Bree is described as an island in the empty lands about. A rare multicultural place where big folk, men, and little folk, hobbits, coexisted on friendly terms, and where groups of traveling dwarves frequently stopped for food, lodging, ale, and story swapping amidst their journeys. Bree was a day's journey beyond the borders of Buckland. Few hobbits other than an occasional Bucklander or adventurous Took ever visited the peculiar village, whose unique location at an intersection on major roads gave rise to the saying, strange as news from Bree. The town's main destination for visitors was a tavern inn called the Prancing Pony. And it's at the Prancing Pony that the drama of this next character sketch is going to unfold. There's a heck of a lot you could say about Strider / Aragorn. We'll be talking about him a lot in future episodes. So today we're just going to focus on his encounter with the hobbits at the Prancing Pony and the peculiar dilemma that he had of trying to convince them in the midst of the dangers as well as the confusion and the distrust of the times that he was the man to accompany them. So Strider in the original manuscripts was called Trotter. And he was actually described as a weather-beaten hobbit with wooden shoes. So thank God for multiple drafts, huh? Strider is first described as a strange-looking, weather-beaten man smoking a long-stemmed pipe, curiously carved. He wears high boots of supple leather that are caked with mud and wears a travel-stained cloak of heavy dark green. He wears a hood that overshadows his face and is observed sitting ominously in the shadows, listening intently to the hobbits. So from the outset, they are inclined to distrust him. He is a ranger, a group Tolkien has described as follows. In the wild lands beyond Bree, there were mysterious wanderers. The Bree folk called them rangers and knew nothing of their origin. They were taller and darker than the men of Bree and were believed to have strange powers of sight and hearing, and to understand the languages of beasts and birds. They roamed at will southwards and eastwards, even as far as the Misty Mountains, but they were now few and rarely seen. So Barley Man Butterbur is the innkeeper who sort of oversees the festivities at the Prancing Pony. He tells the hobbits that the mysterious stranger eyeing them is called Strider, and careful now, he's a ranger. He says he's one of the wandering folk. He seldom talks, not but what he can tell us a rare tale when he has the mind. He disappears for a month or a year, and then he pops up again. Even though we learn later that Strider seemed to be held in awe by most of the Breelanders. Nevertheless, both he and the Rangers were often misunderstood and viewed with suspicion or worse. Later on, during the Council of Elrond, when Boromir's kind of challenging Aragorn's authority and is kind of dissing him, this is before they get to know one another, Strider speaks of the hidden and unregarded role the Rangers fill as protectors of the Shire, so that, quote, simple folk can be free from care and fear. And yet he is then compelled to respond to Boromir's challenge to his integrity, saying, lonely men are we, and yet less thanks have we than you. Travelers scowl at us, and countrymen give us scornful names. The first encounter with Strider occurs when he beckons Frodo, who warily approaches. Strider throws back his hood, showing a shaggy head of dark hair flecked with gray, and in a pale, stern face, a pair of keen gray eyes. He seems to know something of their danger and speaks sternly of the antics of the hobbits thus far, warning Frodo that he should stop his friends from talking so much. His concerns prove justified when Frodo ends up slipping on the ring and vanishing in the sight of all, prompting no small amount of rumor and alarm. So Strider says that he has something of advantage to offer Frodo. Though he adds, I shall want a reward. And it says that Frodo suspects he's taken up with a rascal. And he even begins to wonder, is this guy going to rob me? What's his deal? And so this is something that we see often in the Unlooked-for friend. There's an initial distrust, suspicion, wariness because of the uncertainty of the times. Who knows who can be trusted? Sound familiar? So, Frodo suspects ill motives, but Strider reassures him that his reward is simply this. You must take me along with you until I wish to leave you. Strider begins telling them of the Black Riders and just what peril they face. He says, do you wish them to find you? They are terrible. But he reassures them, I know all the lands between the Shire and the Misty Mountains, for I have wandered over them for many years. I am older than I look. I might prove useful. Strider can take you by paths that are seldom trodden. Will you have him? And a moment later, you will never get to Rivendell now on your own, and to trust me is your only chance. So there's something poignant and very contemporary, I would say, recognizable in this potentially tragic scene. Imagine if Strider can't get them to trust him. Imagine if he can never win them over. Basically, story's over. So as the story unfolds, of course, Strider's true identity will unfold. He is indeed their only hope. He is Aragorn, son of Arathorn, exiled king of Gondor, and worthiest among men. But the hobbits do not know this, and neither do the readers at this point. The confusion and alienation of the times creates a great gulf of suspicion. No one knows who to trust. Sam is the hardest to convince, and he's the one who holds out the longest. Strider knows what's at stake even more than Frodo and his friends. He has all the tools and qualifications. He is exactly the friend they need at this moment. And yet he encounters them among circumstances and in a place where trust has been deeply compromised. His disreputable appearance, his mysterious affiliation as a ranger, his sketchy background, They're all against him. Unfortunately, this is currently all the hobbits have to go on. And appearances do little to reassure them. Strider must find some way to convince them to have him, to let him be their guide, and he must win their trust in a situation that is anything but conducive to it. And even Butterbur says, well, you know your own business maybe, but if I was in your plight, I wouldn't take up with a ranger. As a priest working with teenagers for many years, I often felt like I could understand Strider's predicament. Well, certainly no ranger and no Aragorn. I did have certain skills, certain knowledge based upon tradition. I had access to a store of lore, if you will, that could be helpful to the younger generation to help them navigate the difficult journey of their life. And yet, just because of the generation gap, because of the burdens of history, because of the unfortunate sins of the church, particularly clergy, and just kind of a secular culture that in general teaches young people to despise or distrust authority, particularly religious authority. It was very hard. It was very hard to get into the position where I could be of service and value to the kids. Oftentimes, just by the time I had won them over, the semester was over. So, at any rate, I can really, in my own small realm of experience, I can relate to the poignant situation that was faced here. The incalculable tragedy of the Hobbit's near rejection of Strider is narrowly averted thanks only to an unexpected note from Gandalf, which is at last produced. It had been entrusted to Butterbur to give to Frodo, but the absent-minded innkeeper forgot to give it. Until now. So the sheepish Butterbur hands over the note, which contains an endorsement for Strider, along with this poem, which we later find out was penned by none other than Bilbo Baggins. I absolutely love this poem. All that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. From the ashes a fire shall be woken. A light from the shadows shall spring. Renewed shall be blade that was broken. The crownless again shall be king. So the limitations of judging by appearances are manifestly demonstrated. All that is gold does not glitter. And you could also say all that glitters is not gold. How well we've seen that in our contemporary age. Even Strider will agree that my looks are against me. After the letter is read, Frodo asks, well, why didn't you tell me you were Gandalf's friend at once? It would have saved time. Strider replies that he knew nothing of the letter. And he says, for all I know, I had to persuade you to trust me without proofs. And then he adds, this is rather poignant, he says, I must admit that I hoped you would take to me for my own sake. A hunted man sometimes wearies of distrust and longs for friendship. So Strider is an unlooked-for friend whose asked-for reward is simply to be allowed to be a gift, to be allowed to make his particular contribution. He simply wishes to be of service to them and their quest. This is his reward in exchange for one of the most elite skill sets in all of Middle-earth, put graciously and completely at the service of 4 humble hobbits from the Shire. Handsome is as handsome does, as we say in the Shire, says Sam. The glitterless Strider conceals the golden Aragorn, who will go on to admirably fulfill Sam's proverb, and then some. Next up on the list of unlooked-for friends, Galadriel. This scene we're going to discuss next is one of my favorite scenes in the whole entire story. And I really can't read it without tearing up every time. So if I get a little bit verklempt during this section, fair warning. So Galadriel, as we know, she is the radiant, golden-haired elf queen of Lothlorien and one of the oldest living beings in all of Middle-earth. There's a tremendous backstory to her in the Silmarillion. If you're a total Tolkien geek like me, you've read the Silmarillion, you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, we don't have time to get into that now. but she provides inestimable aid and gifts to all the members of the fellowship who are grieving and reeling after the loss of Gandalf when they come slinking to the borders of Lothlorien, seeking some much needed rest, solace, and comfort. So her friendship is not exactly unlooked for, as Strider deliberately sets out for Lothlorien to seek aid and counsel from her and her woodland kin. But she proves to be a friend in ways too numerous and significant to really discuss in a limited segment such as this. But instead, I would just like to focus on one way in particular in which she proves to be an unlooked-for friend, and that is in regard to our friend Gimli, the dwarf. So there's a long and troubled history between the elves and the dwarves. Again, you can read about it in the Silmarillion. It's alluded to in The Lord of the Rings. You get the idea that these two races have never really gotten along too well. There's a lot of baggage of history. There's a lot of hurts and wounds and injuries done to the one group by the other and vice versa. So their alienation surfaces early on when Haldir, the elf from Lorien, comes out to meet the exhausted and mournful companions near the outer borders of the secret and sacred wooded realm of Lothlorien. So Legolas does the talking. Makes sense. The elf will speak to the elves. And he names only 7 of the companions. It's kind of funny. He's like, well, we got 8. And he says, well, who are they? And he names them. But he only names 7. And so this doesn't escape the notice of Haldir. He said, you have only mentioned 7. Who's the 8th? And Legolas says, the 8th is a dwarf. A dwarf? That is not well, replies Haldir. We have not had dealings with the dwarves since the dark days. They are not permitted in our land. I cannot allow him to pass. Frodo talks up Gimli, testifies to his virtues. He reminds Haldir that Elrond himself chose Gimli as part of the fellowship. Haldir finally relents, but insists that Gimli be blindfolded as he is led into the heart of the realm. This was not at all to the liking of Gimli, writes Tolkien, with great ironic understatement. So then there's an argument that ensues when Gimli digs in his heels and he refuses. Aragorn very wisely intervenes, showing his pretty formidable skills as a diplomat. He insists that all the companions will be blindfolded. Alas, for the folly of these days, says Legolas. Here are all enemies of the one enemy, and yet I must walk blind while the sun is merry in the woodland under leaves of gold. And then Haldir replies this great line. He says, indeed, in nothing is the power of the Dark Lord more clearly shown than the estrangement that divides all those who still oppose him. Yet Haldir insists, nevertheless. So little were the faith and trust left to the world of that time outside of their borders. So again, we can pretty easily relate to this state of alienation and mistrust carrying over from the last chapter we just talked about. So, as we all know, the readers know, but Haldir and the elves don't know, just what Gimli has come from. He's come from Moria, where he had dreams of being reunited with his kin, dreams which are cruelly dashed as he discovers that they have all been slain. Imagine, this joyous expectation of this homecoming. Nobody wants to go to Moria except Gimli, because he's like, yeah, that's where Balin is. That's where my kin are. I can catch up with them. He thinks he's coming home, only to find the place decimated. Only to find that all the people that he loved and was hoping to be reunited with had been slain. That's pretty poignant stuff. So then, of course, with the other companions, he fights bitterly, and he barely escapes with his life after witnessing the horror of the Balrog and Gandalf's fall on the bridge of Khazad-dûm. And so now, after all this, he comes to a place of shelter at long last, where he hopes to get rest and to grieve, only to encounter a chilly reception, to put it mildly.
The dwarf breathed so loud we could have shot him in the dark.
And yet, everything changes with Galadriel. The 8 companions are led to an audience before the Lord Celeborn and his queen. Celeborn reminds the dwarves that it was they who awakened the Balrog through their greed. He can't resist throwing in that little jab. Galadriel comes to Gimli's defense. She says, "Do not repent of your welcome to the dwarf. If our folk had been exiled long and far from Lothlorien, who of the Galadrim, even Celeborn the Wise, would pass nigh and would not wish to look upon their ancient home?" What comes next is even more surprising. She speaks favorably of the old revered strongholds of Gimli's kin, and she even uses their proper dwarvish names. It says, "She looked upon Gimli, who sat glowering and sad, and she smiled." And the dwarf, hearing the names given in his own ancient tongue, looked up and met her eyes, and it seemed to him that he looked suddenly into the heart of an enemy and saw their love and understanding. Wonder came into his face, and then he smiled in answer. He rose clumsily and bowed in dwarf fashion, saying, "Yet more fair is the living land of Lorien, and the Lady Galadriel is above all the jewels that lie beneath the earth." Ages of bitterness and recrimination are undone in this one moment of kindness. By using Gimli's language and speaking to him with compassion and tenderness, she softens his heart. Galadriel is for Gimli the unlooked-for friend. She represents her race, he represents his. And in a singular moment of mutual redemption, an old history is undone and a new one is begun. Gimli declares her publicly and before all to be greater than even the jewels under the earth, the grasping for which proved the perennial dwarvish downfall. The final reversal occurs at their parting. Galadriel offers thoughtfully chosen gifts to each member of the company. When it comes to Gimli, she asks, "And what gift would a dwarf ask of the elves?" "None, lady," replies Gimli. "It is enough for me to have seen the Lady of the Galadrim, and to have heard her gentle words. Hear, all ye elves," she cries to her kin. "Let none say again that dwarves are grasping and ungracious." Galadriel yet insists that Gimli choose a gift. His poetic tenderness has now been fully awakened. She has released the poet in this ordinarily taciturn being. He responds that he desires only a single strand of your hair, which surpasses the gold of the earth, as the stars surpass the gems of the mine. "I do not ask for such a gift, but you commanded me to name my desire." At this we read that the elves murmured with astonishment, and Celeborn gazed on the dwarf with wonder, while Galadriel only smiled. "Never have any made to me such a request, so bold and yet so courteous." She asked Gimli, "What would you do with such a gift?" And he says, "Treasure it, lady, in memory of your words to me at our first meeting." He promises that it will be set in crystal, to be revered as an heirloom to his people and as a pledge of goodwill between the mountain and the wood, the dwarves and the elves, until the end of days. So she responds with gratuity and abundance, giving him not one, like he asked, but 3 strands of her hair. Finally, she prophesies blessings and moral victory for Gimli. She says, "If hope should not fail, then I say to you, Gimli, son of Gloin, that your hands shall flow with gold, and yet over you gold shall have no dominion." Ah, that is great, great stuff. So Galadriel chooses to honor Gimli, and she trusts that he would be moved to respond in kind. Knots of alienation, ancient knots of alienation, were untied, and fresh new strands of fellowship were knit anew. In gladness of this moment, Thanks to the kindness of Galadriel, Gimli realizes wherein true wealth lies. Not in the dwarvish desire for gold, but rather true gold. The hair strands that are neither prized for their utilitarian nor monetary value. Instead, it's something only a captivated and moved heart can appreciate. The hair of Galadriel is treasured because of the reverence and the love for the one from whom it came. The one who spoke kindness and blessing to his heart and spirit at a moment when he was at his lowest. Its value is personal, not economic. A careful reading reveals that only from this point does the friendship between Gimli and Legolas, who had previously not exactly been the best of friends in the Fellowship, this friendship now begins to blossom. And in the Two Towers and in the Return of the King, we're going to see them become fast friends or even become traveling companions together after the quest is complete. So Galadriel is thus the unlooked-for friend for Gimli, whose tenderness toward the outsider changes hearts, builds friendships, reconciles races, and redeems history.